I think one of the things that as I watched the inauguration and the prayers and all, that so many of them were prayed in Jesus' name. Did you notice that? Yes. I thought that was just a real departure from what's happened, and I really thank God. Now I know that some of the Muslims may have been disappointed, or some of the Jewish folks, but to those of us who have a little bias, I think it was a good thing. To our people in the overflow room, I hope that you feel a part of us. I wouldn't necessarily if I was over there, but I hope you do. And to those of you who are watching us on the satellite, we're glad that you're along with us. We hear reports of that all the time. We're working on something that I think will be exciting for us. That we're working on a piece of equipment and some things so we can stream this service in its completion while it's live. We can do, as we're going forward in our services, we can send them to your television and to your computer. So that's just something ahead of us. Well, as Marty read to us today from the New Testament, I want to read to you a passage of Scripture from the Old Testament that pretty well puts in perspective the impossibilities that were being faced by the children of Israel. And it occurs in Exodus chapter 14, and it begins with verse 10. And I'm reading from one of my oldest Bibles because that's when I began to preach the sermon I'm going to preach to you today. My first time was 1977. And I've preached it all over the world since. But as it says in verse 10, as Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up, and there were the Egyptians marching after them. They were terrified and cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, "Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we say to you in Egypt, 'Leave us alone, let us serve the Egyptians'? It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert." Well, that's facing an impossibility. Now, there are a couple of times in the Bible where Jesus used the word impossible. One was in Mark 10, when Jesus was confronting the rich young ruler and said to him, "Sell all your possessions and give it to the poor," that the young man walked away sorrowful because he could not do that. And the disciples, looking at the rich man, because it was the wealthy and the rich that had all the blessings and had all the benefits of their riches, the disciples looked at the Lord and said, "Well, man, if he can't get into heaven, how can he ever get there?" And the Lord looked at them and it said, "Well, with man, those things are impossible, but with God, all things are possible." And then the other was, as Marty read from Hebrews chapter 11, verse 6, without faith, it is impossible to please God. Now, there are a lot of us in this place today who are facing impossibilities. We need to try to erase that word out of our mind if we can, because we just heard the passage of Scripture that it is that without faith it is impossible to please God, but with faith all things are possible. And when we look at the impossibilities in our lives, or when we look at the challenges in our lives, there are three questions that we always ask. Number one, what does God want by having me or allowing me to go through this time of impossibilities? What does God want? The second question is this: how does he want to solve it? How does he want to cure it? How does he want to change it? How does he want to make it different? How does he want us maybe to live with the situation until he finds ways that are beyond our ways. And then the third question is this: what instrument, what person, what situation does he plan to use to bring this impossibility into the possibility category? Now, I know that seems kind of out of the world, but God has something in mind for every one of us, and he has something in mind for every situation and circumstance that we are facing. Here's the deal. Moses was on the backside of the desert, you know that, and as he was tending sheep and having a good time out there, the Lord came to him and just simply said, I want you to lead my people out of captivity, out of Egypt. Now, Moses made a bunch of excuses. I don't speak very well. They'll kill me if I go back. Don't you understand? I'm happy out here in the desert. And God said to him, you are the one. Go do what I ask you to do. So he goes. He talks to Pharaoh. He says, let my people go. God said, if you don't, you're going to really be in trouble. Pharaoh fought him on this. But then all of a sudden, 600,000 men and their dependents marched out into the desert from captivity, out of slavery, into freedom, but also into an impossible situation. Here were the mountains on one side. Here was the sea on the other side. Here were Pharaoh's army coming at them from the backside. They only had one channel to go through, and that was the one that God had prepared for them. Today, because we're human, you and I we got the mountains on one side and the Salton Sea, I guess you'd call that a sea, on the other side. And, and Pharaoh's forces, or the evils of the world, or whatever you want to call the temptations of the world, and how devil acts and how he attacks us. And we basically have one channel before us, and that is to follow the direction and the guidance that the Lord has in mind for us. And so here they were. There were three conversations. One had to do with the people. And in verse 16, the people began to speak. And they said to Moses, what in the world are you doing to us? Were there not enough graves in Egypt? Did we have to come out into the desert and look for places to be buried? And you know that some of those people were going to die before they got to where they were headed. I mean, there were almost 2 million people. Don't you know, Moses, that we had a place to live, we had food to eat, we had things to do, and now you got us out here and the wind's blowing and there's sand in our teeth and we don't know what's going to happen next. What are you doing to us? And you and I know that there are times when we have that sense of saying, Lord, what in the world's going on? I've been doing okay. I mean, everything's been going fine. Now you get me out of my comfort zone and you got me doing things or giving me stuff to deal with, and I'm not sure that's exactly what I want. Couldn't we just go back to the way it was and not have to deal with all these things that are in front of us? And the answer is no. Life goes on. The next day always comes, and little things happen along the way, and we find ourselves in the desert, and literally there's the mountain on one side and the sea on the other side, and Satan coming on the backside. We only have one channel to go, and that's to walk in the way that the God has provided for us. And you remember from reading the scripture that as the children of Israel were moving out of Egypt, there was a cloud that would be there to guide them in the daytime, and there was a fire that would guide them at night. They were never outside of God's sight or outside of God's presence, but they could not grasp it. They could not understand that in life there have to be a few potholes before we get to the main highway. And it just happened that as they moved out of Egypt, they thought they were in a great big pothole. And so in verse 11, there was the conversation that the people had with Moses. But then beginning in verse 13, there was the response that Moses gave to them from the conversation he had had with God. And here's what it says. There's 4 different things that they were asked to do. When life faces you with impossibilities, I'm going to give you 4 things that you can take on your journey to the promised land. And I don't mean heaven, I mean the promised land. So, number 1 is this. He said, fear not. Why? Fear paralyzes us. Fear causes us to be insecure. Fear causes us to be paranoid, to think everything crazy and wrong. Fear causes us to cower in a little corner and just say, well, I guess this is the way it's always going to be, and I'm just going to always be this way, and I guess I'll just have to accept the way it is. No, you don't. Fear not, Jesus said to us on many occasions. Fear not, the angel said to us on that one occasion when Jesus was born. And here was God saying to Moses, don't be afraid. I've got things worked out. You just have to be patient with me. Second thing he said was this. He said, stand firm, stand firm. Give God a chance to do what he wants to do in your life. Now, I had this crazy thought in my mind, and just stay with me because I get crazy thoughts. So, and I never heard this preached this way before, but so you got 2 million people out in the sand, right? And some of them are, I mean, you know, I don't know if they went in straight lines or if they spread out, or I don't know how they did. I mean, I know they wandered around a long time. But say a bunch of them just started to just say, I'm not hanging with these guys anymore. I'm going to find my own way. And then all of a sudden, everybody just took off in all different directions. I could just see chariots going everywhere, and sheep and lambs and cattle just all in the middle and everywhere. No, that's not what he said. He said, first of all, fear not, stand firm. In other words, don't give up, don't panic, don't run, don't go to some crazy theology or philosophy that is not God-given. Stand firm. Just hang in there. Hang in there. Hang in there. And then the third thing he said was, and see the salvation of the Lord. Now, here's what's funny about this. They had only been in the desert 5 days when they started all the grumbling. 5 days. I mean, they barely got their shoes on and stuff. They were just out there 5 simple days, and here they were griping and complaining, and aren't there any graves or anything? In other words, and then Moses said to them, see the salvation of the Lord. Count your blessings. See what God is going to do for us. See the things that God has in mind for us. Don't allow yourselves to get to the place where you allow the present to block out the past so that you cannot move with confidence into the future. God wants us to acknowledge the things that he has done for us in the past. And I know we sing the little song, count your many blessings, name them one by one, and you'll be able to see all the things that God has done. Well, you can. I mean, that's why we sing that little song. Because we see the things that God has done for us and through us and with us, and he's not through with us. And then there was the last thing that Moses said to them was just this. Be still. Stop mumbling. Stop grumbling. Stop gossiping. Stop finding fault. Stop being mad at your neighbor. Just be still and let's wait and see what God has in mind for us. The still voice of God. And you know, when we think of that being still, and I know and you know that my motor runs all the time, and so it's really hard for me to be still because I'm thinking about this and thinking about that and thinking about you and praying for you, and if I don't see you on Sunday, I get mad at you, and then I have to pray that God will forgive me, and then I call you, and then I'm nice to you, but I'm really mad at you. And so you know, there's a whole big deal going on there that we have to deal with all the time. When you are built like I'm built, or you have a personality like I have, which is hard to be still. I got to have something going all the time. Even when I'm studying, I got to have the radio playing. I can't have a lot of quietness because I keep thinking somebody's sneaking up behind me or something. I need to know something. And so here he is. The people are saying to him, okay, what's the deal? Aren't there enough graves in Egypt? And they're being sarcastic, and they're doing all this stuff, and they're making it tough on Moses. And he goes to the Lord, and he's crying and griping and complaining. But the Lord said, before you do, tell people to think about all the good things I've done, and tell them about the fact that I'm going to give them leadership and guidance. Tell them that they already have a cloud in front of them and a fire at night. Tell them that I'm present with them all the time. And then God speaks to Moses, and he was not very nice to Moses. You need to know that. Because Moses was griping and complaining too, and he had only been there 5 days. I mean, I know that if you're going to have 2 million people in the desert, that's quite a job. They didn't even have microphones in those days. How did they do all that? Anyway, so here's what the Lord said. The Lord said, "Why are you crying out to me? I have told you what to do." Now, I don't know the whole Bible that well, but I do know, I don't know many places in the Bible where it says, stop praying and just do what you need to do. But in Exodus 14, that's exactly what God said to Moses. He said, stop griping, stop complaining, stop praying, stop wringing your hands, stop telling me what you want and what you don't want. And then he says, obey me, possess the land, be brave. And then he said these words. He says, go forward, go forward. And I'm a firm believer in that God's plan for you is that your future be better than your past. And that if you live in the past, you'll never enjoy the future that God has in mind for us. But beyond that, if you don't accept the future that God has in mind for us, then you are being disobedient to the things he wants to do in your life. And see, when you erase the word impossible, then you are saying to God, all things are possible. Now, I know that you all won't just erase the word impossible because some of you are already saying it's impossible to erase the word impossible. And that's not good, but you got to train ourselves. That's why we get up in the morning and we say, this is the day the Lord hath made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it. Why? Because it's moving from one day to the next with a hope and a joy that this day is going to be better than the last. Now, the God bag. Bev and I, when we were young pastors in Salem, Oregon, were invited to a gathering up in Eastern Oregon in a beautiful lodge where a group of people from Salem who worked with Young Life and worked with various other agencies were gathered together for a little retreat. And the guy that they had called to be the speaker was an old grizzled ex-sheriff from Eastern Oregon. And he stood up there and his vocabulary was terrible. And he looked like one of those guys from, those Alaska programs on TV that we watch. He looked like he had just come out of the bush, man. And his denim shirt was all wrinkled, and he had all this. You just sat there thinking, are you kidding me? I came all the way up to hear this guy. And then he began to speak. And he began to tell of his life and how all of a sudden everything just imploded, just gave in on him. And he talked about the fact that he began to drink and he began to use drugs, and he lost his wife. And when he lost his wife, he lost his family. And when he lost his family, he went deeper and deeper into drugs and alcohol. And then the word got out, and he was voted out as sheriff. And now he didn't have a job, and they were going to foreclose on his house. And I mean, he just told this crazy, crazy story of loss. I mean, it was Job all over the place, without a lot of people bugging him. It was just his story. But then he said this. He said he was sitting in his kitchen at the kitchen table. And he had a radio on, and he didn't know, naturally, that it was on a religious station or anything. But all of a sudden, he started listening to this guy on the radio. And he was talking about God's love, and he was talking about how God can help us through any situation, and how God is a miracle worker, and how God has in mind those things that we had not even thought of yet for ourselves, that beyond anything that we have in mind for ourselves, God has something better or greater or more spectacular, that we just need to believe in him. And then the guy on the radio said, there's someone listening that needs God's help in a very significant way. But he said, before you can get that, you need to know Jesus Christ. And he said, if you're listening to me, wherever you are, if you're listening to me, bow your heads. I want to lead you to Jesus Christ. And he prayed the sinner's prayer, and he talked about forgiveness, and he talked about acceptance, and he talked about surrender and all these things, and giving things to the Lord. And this old grizzled ex-sheriff at his breakfast table gave his life to the Lord that morning. He was eating lunch. And he took an old, wrinkled lunch bag. Because he said, I've got to find some way to personalize my needs, and I've got to personalize my request to the Lord. I've got to find some way that I can make this thing work. And he took an old lunch bag, and he opened it, and he dumped out the potato chips and all the other things in it, he said. And he found a crayon. And on the back of that old lunch bag, he wrote the words, God bag. And he taped it up on the refrigerator door. And he took some strips of paper, and on those pieces of paper, he wrote, please God, restore my marriage. And he dropped it in the bag. And then he said, please God, restore my children to me. And he dropped it in the bag. He said, God, give me strength to stop drinking and to stop using drugs because I know it's killing me. And he dropped it in the bag. Lord, please give me gainful employment because I've got to save my house because that's all I've got left. And then he said, oh God, please restore my reputation to the people who one time had faith in me. I mean, these 5 or 6 things that were so dramatic, and he dropped them in the bag, and he put it on the back of the refrigerator, and he taped it there. And every day he would walk by that bag, and he would stand before it, and he would say, God, I know that you don't need to be reminded, but I'm human, and I want to remind you of the different things that I have asked you to do, and I just want you to know I trust you, and I'm surrendering to you, and would you take these impossibilities in my life and restore them? And one day his wife came back because she had seen that he had changed. And that next Thanksgiving, all the kids were seated around the Thanksgiving table. And he hadn't even noticed, but he had stopped drinking and stopped using drugs. He couldn't even figure it out, but all of a sudden he was feeling so much better and making sense when he talked to people, and he was able to pull that out of the bag. And then he ran for sheriff again. And he got reelected. And he saved his house. And there was not a dry eye in that place as this old grizzled ex-sheriff began to talk and speak to us, because all of a sudden we were recognizing, you got to get this, if God can do that for one person, he can do that for every person. Amen. And he took that sack. And he said, that wasn't all I put in it. He said, I wore out God bags because I was always going in and coming out and putting things in and taking things out, because all of a sudden it came to me that when God said all things are possible to him who believed, I believed with all my heart, and it changed my life. And when we came away from that retreat and drove down the hills into the Salem area and down by Detroit Lake and around through there and back home again, there was this kind of glow that seemed to permeate our lives because we had seen a man go through the desert. He'd been surrounded by the sea and by the mountain, and Pharaoh's forces were coming behind. And do you know what God did? He put a cloud so that the Pharaoh's forces could not do anything. And he brought him to the sea, and it was all mucky. And I don't know if you've driven by any of the washes, but there's a lot of mud and guck and stuff in there. And he said to Moses, he said, you can't go through on that land. You'll get stuck in there. But he said, the moment you put your staff down, it will become dry. And Moses put his staff down on the edge of that mucky sea, and it was dry, and they came across, and God confused the chariots, and he made the wheels bend, and they went around in circles, and they bumped into each other, and all those kind of things. And when the last guy of that 2 billion people got across that and wiped his brow saying, whoa, man, I made it, the sea returned. I don't understand all that. All I know is that in every one of our lives, you got to hear me, there is that moment when we got to put our staff of faith. And we've got a staff of faith, and we've got to believe. Because without faith, it is impossible to please God. And that staff of faith is God's permission to open up the world in which you live so that God can do for you what nobody else can do. Now, in a moment, we're going to sing a song. And you're going to be given a God bag. That God bag says, Friendship Church, Sunday, January 26, 2017. We spared no expense for you. Nothing is impossible. I mean, if you don't use it for a prayer thing, just use it for a lunch. I mean, you got a bag for a lunch if you want it. But in a minute as we sing, they're going to pass you out a bag. Nobody opened the bag until everybody has a bag. And then we'll tell you more. God bless you.